Hi everyone, welcome to part 3. Okay, so Carlsen has just played knight takes a5, and Aronian continued with rook f e8, which is adding pressure down the d file and encouraged Carlsen to finally resolve his central pawns with e5, and they've done a great job from where they were. White has won a pawn due to the pressure, and although this makes defending easier for black, white will retain a lasting advantage as the middle game continues, not only because of his material advantage but also positionally. White is still better, and there's the threat of knight takes c6 now, which wasn't advisable on the last move. We can see why. If knight takes c6, e4 is dropping, it attacks the queen, but queen takes e4 is playable. Or after queen takes e4, which is the best move, rook takes e4, and white's dropping a piece, and suddenly the tables are turned, and black is winning. Naturally, Carlsen isn't going to fall into such a simple trap, but there are many others in the position if he's not careful, and it's important that he consolidates his position quickly. And his last move is e5, if we return to it, has weakened d5, and it means that knight d5 can be played, and claiming this outpost was of course something that Aronian had in mind when he sacked his a pawn, and this move has the added bonus of defending the c6 pawn from the knight, the rook's defending it. And black has some initiative now thanks to the attack on the e3 bishop. So Aronian is hoping, for activity and compensation for his sacrificed pawn. And Carlsen calmly played bishop d2, which controls the forward motion of the knight on d5 and applies pressure already to the weakened b4 pawn. And Aronian followed up with rook e d8, again applying pressure to the backward d4 pawn, which is the newly created weakness in the white position. And white has to take care now not to fall prey to tactics. There is some pressure on his position here, and his a5 knight is loose, and Aronian probably envisaged this position or something similar when he sacked his a pawn. But as long as white takes care, he'll be fine. And Carlsen continued logically with knight f4, which is aiming to trade off this strong d5 knight. And Aronian at this stage went astray in his calculations and played queen a7, which has two threats. That's attacking the a5 knight and threatening bishop takes e5, because from a7 the queen is pinning the backward d4 pawn. And if knight c4 now, which apparently defends e5 and gets the knight out of danger, there's queen takes d4, check. But there's a problem with this move that allowed Carlsen a tactical shot to win a second pawn, and we'll see that in a moment. Better for black was queen c7, which attacks the knight without the tactical problem that we'll see in a moment. And best play continues knight c4, and only now queen a7, where black will win back a pawn on a2, but white still stands better. But there's more compensation in this line for black, which presumably is what Aronian was hoping for. So after queen a7, Carlsen played a very nice tactical shot, and if you want to try and spot it, then stop the video now. You have to bear in mind that the knight's attacked, d4 is attacked, and bishop takes e5 is threatened. So what's the answer for white? It's a very nice move, in fact the only move to retain the advantage. Knight takes c6. And this is the problem with the immediate queen a7, and the knight apparently sacrifices itself, but the point is that it takes away the support of the knight here on d5, which the knight and the queen are both attacking. So if rook takes c6, then knight takes d5 is possible, and you know the knight is no longer attacked by the queen, and there's no bishop takes e5, obviously, because of knight takes a7. And black has no choice here but to accept, or he's going to lose at least the exchange, because the knight is attacking the rook and the queen. So rook takes c6, knight takes f4, attacking the white queen isn't an option, because if knight takes a7, knight takes g2, knight takes c8, and white wins into the exchange and 2 pawns up without difficulty. It will be a completely one game, obviously. So rook takes c6, now knight takes d5, and white is now 2 pawns up, and there's no queen takes a2 here because of knight e7 check, picking up the c6 rook. And Aronian elected instead for rook c2, which gains a rook on the 7th and pins the bishop. But there are a few threats in mind. Bishop takes e5 is now again on the cards, and also bishop h6 is kind of tricky. And you know, this is the best that black can hope for. He could play instead queen takes d4 check, but now comes bishop e3, and the bishop supported by the knight, and this forces queen takes e5, and now another very nice tactical shot, knight e7 check, forces queen takes e7, and suddenly the rook is exposed. So rook takes d8, queen takes d8, queen takes c6, and once more white is going into a completely winning endgame, the exchange up. So there's some very nice tactical play going on deep in the position for both sides. It's a very nice game by both players. So rook c2 is what Aronian played, and here Carlsen very calmly played king h1, which removes the threat not only of bishop takes e5, but also queen takes d4, which we'll see why that is in a moment. And Aronian continued with bishop f8. If he plays instead queen takes d4, white can deal with the problem of his pinned bishop immediately with bishop takes b4, which, you know, discovers an attack on the queen, and thanks to king h1, rook takes g2 won't be played with check. And you know, it's the best that black can do anyway, but he's going a piece down here after rook takes d4, threatening knight e7 check, which is going to win the d8 rook because of the rook on d4, and you know, white is piece up, and as well as 2 pawns, so it's just completely lost for black. So bishop f8 is what Aronian did play, and now came e6 from Carlsen, which is another very nice and accurate move that pushes his edge to well over the 2 pawns he's up. And once again we see the power of the mobile pawn center. Aronian found one of the correct defenses, queen a8. Other moves didn't work. For example, if f5, simply rook f e1, threatening e7, keeps the initiative for white. Best play continues rook e8, e7, bishop h6, and knight takes b4, which is going to force exchanges, and goes into a far better endgame for black. The rook on c2 is attacked by the knight. If it moves, then the bishop on h6 is falling. So play would continue. Rook takes d2, rook takes d2, bishop takes d2, queen takes d2, rook takes e7, and white should win from here without much difficulty. Another failed defense for black after e6 is f takes e6, where the move for white is queen e4, which is forking the rook on c2 and the pawn on g6, and white is now winning with an advantage of 3.5 pawns. The best that black can do is rook takes a2. If instead e takes d5, queen takes g6 check, queen g7, queen takes c2. Again, again is an easy win. So rook takes a2 is best for black. But now comes queen takes g6 check, queen g7. If instead king h8 and rook f7 wins the queen for a rook, and again is a simple win. Even after queen takes f7, queen takes f7, rook takes d5. Black has a rook and a knight against the queen, but his position is far too loose to survive for very long. So queen g7 is correct, but now queen takes e6 check, king h8 is the only reasonable move, but now comes rook f7, and black is tied up in knots. He has to find very accurate moves in order to survive. The only move here for him really to defend is rook a6. So in the event of rook takes g7, there's rook takes e6. And here white continues queen f5, retaining the initiative. The queen has to move. g6 is the best square, and the best that black can do. But the endgame, as before, is hopeless after, for example, bishop f4, queen takes f5, and rook takes f5. So, queen a8 is one of the correct defenses for black. And Carlsen continued with e takes f7 check, which is one of two winning continuations for white, the other one being e7, which forces rook takes d5. You know, white is dropping this piece as it was attacked by the queen and the rook. And now, not e takes f8 and queening, but simply e8 queening, which is winning the exchange. You know, queen takes e8 is forced here, and now queen takes d5. And again, white is the exchange up with a pawn to boot, and not much compensation for black. And you know, this is a good continuation, but the variation that Carlsen chose, despite apparently being objectively weaker on the very deep computer analysis, was a good human choice, as it led to a lot of simplification and resulted in a winning endgame. In actual fact, it required a lot more calculation to figure out, and in that respect it is more impressive than this line, where although white is winning, the presence of the queens will create big complications despite being the exchange up. So let's return to the game. Carlsen has just played e takes f7 check, and Aronian played king h8. This makes little difference if he plays king g7. h8 is obviously more solid, and white is now obliged to save his knight. It's attacked by the rook and the queen, as I said. And Carlsen played knight f4, which, you know, as I said, this line is the human continuation, because this is forcing the queens off, and it's going to go into you know, a winning endgame. White is 3 pawns up. He's going to give one of them back, and you know, go into a technically winning endgame. And play continued. Queen takes g2. And if black tries to keep the queens on instead, for example, with queen a6, because he also has to defend the g6 pawn, and if he plays g5, the queens come off anyway, so queen takes a8. So queen a6 to defend g6. Now comes queen e4, which is forking the rook and the g6 pawn, as we saw before. And white is totally winning again, and there's no other way to both defend the g6 pawn and keep the queens on, so Aronian is obliged to go into an inferior endgame with queen takes g2. And Carlsen played king takes g2, which means the pin on this bishop still exists but retains the threat on the g6 pawn, although Fritz felt that knight takes g2 instead, despite being passive, was more accurate. So king takes g2, and now rook takes d4. White gives back one of the pawns, as I mentioned, which is an accurate move from Aronian. Taking the a2 pawn instead is losing. After knight takes g6 check, king g7, knight takes f8, rook takes f8, and rook f2, with a hopeless endgame, especially if black falls for rook takes f7, bishop h6 check, king takes h6, rook takes a2. Okay, so rook takes d4, and here Carlsen played once again the only move to retain the advantage, which presumably he'd calculated, you know, when he played the check here on f7 with the pawn, if not before, which is rook f2. It's a very nice and accurate play. Getting impatient and playing knight takes g6 is obviously tactically wrong due to the pressure on the d2 bishop. Instead, for example, king takes g7, knight takes f8, rook d takes d2 check, rook takes d2, rook takes d2, king g1, knight takes f8, where black has very good drawing chances, if not more. Okay, that's the end of part 3.